guys, how are we all today? I hope you guys are having a great day. For those of you who are new here, welcome. My name is Emma Carrington, and if you're interested in true crime and justice, you're in the right place. By way of a disclaimer, we discuss true crime cases involving domestic abuse and domestic homicide on this channel. So if that's not the kind of content you're looking for, I completely understand. Thanks for stopping by. If you do stick around, I hope you consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons because it helps to push these videos out to more people. And by doing so, together we can spread awareness of the warning signs of domestic abuse that people may otherwise overlook. And that's what I'm hoping to achieve by covering these cases. That's what this channel's all about. Thanks for being here. Today we'll be discussing the case of Sandra Wolfe. Sandra Wolfe was a de facto wife living with Mark Burt in southeastern Western Australia. Yeah, I know, that's a mouthful. The couple were together for 28 years and had 3 children together. Sandra explains that in the early years of their relationship, she realized that Mark was controlling and possessive. He had worked hard to isolate her from friends and family. But like many, Sandra says she thought that a shrinking social circle came part and parcel with a loving relationship. In case anyone needs to hear it, that's not the case. In the beginning of the relationship, it's natural to want to spend a lot of time together, but that should settle and you and your partner should have friends and interests outside of the relationship. If your partner is upset about you spending time with others or making it hard to pursue your interests, you may want to put some healthy boundaries in place and just see what pushback you get. Sandra says that arguments were prolific throughout their relationship, but this is the first time it ever gotten physical. They'd both been drinking and Mark apologized profusely afterwards, saying, "I'm so sorry, I can't control myself. I got really angry." Now, a lot of people blame being intoxicated in one form or another for violent outbursts, and they may exacerbate anger and arguments and violence, but it doesn't cause it. There is an underlying problem there in the first place for it to have gotten physical and for someone to cross that boundary.
When I was going through the abuse with Mark, I used to think quite often, how did we get here? When did this start? He was always very controlling. He liked me being at home. That's one reason why he liked us being on the farm. When he was working, he always knew that I was at home, that he knew where I was.
So did you feel like you couldn't go out?
Yeah, and not without asking permission to.
And as is typical in domestic violence cases, when Sandy began to challenge his control, the relationship deteriorated dramatically.
I told you before, I was just getting sick of it. I got to a stage where I didn't like the constriction on my life anymore. I used to say to him, you know, it's like you don't trust me. I started to stand up for myself more. He would get so annoyed with it, and of course then in anger he would lash out.
The first time Mark hit Sandy, he smashed her teeth and gave her 2 black eyes.
That first time he was remorseful afterwards. You know, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do it," you know, all that kind of thing. And he bought me flowers and gifts. But the second time when it happened, his attitude afterwards had changed. Instead of being remorseful or whatever, he was more like, "Oh, well, you deserved it."
A few weeks later, Mark drove Sandy to an isolated rest area late at night. Here he put a noose around her neck and threatened to hang her from a tree.
I was standing on my tippy toe, holding on, screaming at him, "Mark, Mark, stop." Yeah, and then he decides that that's enough. Taught her a lesson.
Sandra says that around 10 years later, they'd both begun using ice, and the drug really changed Mark. She was subjected to beatings at least once a week over the following 3 years. And as she began pulling back from her drug use, Mark would hold it over her head and threaten to tell everyone that she'd been using if she said anything about the abuse he was subjecting her to.
A drug does not make him do that. A drug just takes away the rest of the guilt that goes with it.
On occasions, Sandy was literally tortured into submission.
He dragged me out of the car and pulled the gun out of the back and put it under my chin and said, "This is it. This is what you're going to get. If you don't cut it out, you won't do as you're frickin' told."
Such acts of psychological terror left no visible evidence of trauma, but the punches and objects thrown at her have left permanent scars.
That is from a mobile phone. Yeah. Good shot, eh? Split like a watermelon. Unbelievable. God, the pain.
Sandra tried to leave a number of times. However, there seemed to be no escape. And each time she left, she was forced to return, and the abuse only got worse. Sandra says he used the bull bar of his ute to pin her to a fence. So basically, he drove at her and pinned her to a fence with his car. On one occasion, she said Mark was beating her with an extension cord. He eventually stopped and asked her to go outside with him. Sandra was relieved, thinking that the fight was over, but when they got outside, he looped a rope around her neck and tied the other end of the rope to the back of his ute. He then drove around their property, making her run behind the car, yelling, "Run, dog."
He had hit me a few times with this wooden bar. Wasn't satisfied with that, so he grabbed a small extension cord, and I was on the ground covered, and he was whipping me across the back.
And then Dad told her to come over to the shed. I remember seeing Dad tying something to his ute and put the rope around Mum's neck.
And he says, "I want to see you run." So he gets to the car, starts up, says, "Come on, dog. See you run."
Run, dog. Come on, dog.
An anonymous emergency call reporting the incident was made later that afternoon, but it was 2 days before the police responded. Mark was arrested, held overnight, and fined for breaching the restraining order.
After this incident, Sandra left Mark, but says he started calling and texting her all the time. And on one evening, he started the calls and texts at around 7 p.m, and it went on until about 11. Then he said to her, quote, "That's it. I'm coming around. I've got 3 knives in the back of my car, and they've got your name on them." At the time, the couple's 3 children, 19-year-old Ashley, 17-year-old Aiden, and 15-year-old Emily, were with her. Sandra said she started to really freak out, thinking, "Oh my God, what's he going to do? He's just threatened my life." She says she did something that she'd never done before. She called the police. But they'd be coming from Albany, which was about 40 kilometres away, meaning Mark would arrive before the officers would get there. When Mark did arrive, Sandra took him away from the children and they argued in the bedroom. Sandra says he was yelling at me in the bedroom and chasing me around. He had a knife in his hand and the other 2 were on the floor next to the bed. As she tried to get away, Mark stabbed her in the back of the leg. She says superficially, as it was only the tip of the knife. That's something that abuse victims will often do because the abuser minimises what has taken place for so long that even when something as significant as being stabbed happens, it's downplayed, it's minimized to the point where it's just a superficial, like it could have been worse. It is one of the most common things said in therapy with abuse victims is that it wasn't that bad, it could have been worse. And that comes from having everything be minimized. So she was stabbed superficially in the back of the leg. And that was when the police arrived. Sandra says the officers eventually left when Mark went out and calmly reassured them that nothing was wrong.
Why they didn't separate us, God only knows. It's the first thing that they do.
So really,
you get a chance to talk.
If you'd had a chance that
I
night,
would have told them what was going on. I would have said, well, guess what? You better get me the hell out of here because he has just stabbed me in the back of the leg with a knife. When he first opened the door, he's holding the doorknob with the knife in hand and they can't see it. And I'm sort of in the mode of like, if I say something, then he's gonna lurch at me. And to keep safe, I'm not going to. I'm just going to keep playing the game with Mark and be compliant.
And I have to stop again here because how bad is that? They're there because she called about him, but he comes out and says, oh, nothing to see here. So they just hop back in their car and head on back to town. Something's got to change. The next morning, Mark came at her again while she was in the shower because he'd worked out, his brain finally twigged, that she was the one who had called the police. He ripped the shower curtain and railing down and he beat her with the metal bar. Sandra says he then forced her to go back with him to the home that they'd previously shared in Mount Barker, and her nightmare of weekly beatings continued. Sandra says he was totally not the same person I used to have as a partner. He was vicious, cold and calculating. It was an absolute nightmare. She explains that, quote, violence was never a factor in our lives before this, so I clung to the belief that he would change, that he would come back to me, the Mark that I used to love. I never thought it was going to be permanently broken between us. I wanted to show him this kind of behaviour is not to be tolerated anymore, and he would want to work things out. But in the long run, I was just kidding myself, end quote. Sandra realised that things were never going to get any better, and she had to get out. That's when things went horribly wrong on June the 16th, 2014. Sandra decided the best way to get herself and her daughter out safely was to pick her daughter up from school. But before she arrived, Mark had tracked her down and started to pursue her in their son's Holden Commodore, with their son Aidan in the back seat. The pursuit escalated along Albany Highway, and when Sandra and Mark passed the local TAFE, a Good Samaritan filmed the incident on his dash cam, and he ended up trying to intervene. Sandra says, quote, the driver tried to get his four-wheel drive between Mark and I. Mark pulled the car up and I stopped behind him. He tried to come up and I took off. Mark took off after me and then drove into me at the cinema. The dash cam footage shows Mark ramming Sandra's car off the road. Her car rolls 2 to 3 times before coming to rest on its roof. Sandra says of that moment, quote, Mark swung into me and he almost rolled his car over. My car did roll over about 3 times before it rested on the roof. He had no regard for my life, his life, or his son's life, who was in the back. I was just scared out of my mind. I remember as the car was rolling over, I was trying to hold on to the steering wheel, end quote. After this terrifying incident, Mark tried to play down what had happened, which Sandra said happened often after domestic disputes, which is what we just discussed. And like I said before, this is very common. The minimizing and telling you that you're being dramatic and carrying on. But ramming a person off the road and causing their car to flip 3 times cannot be minimized. But this shithead, he sure tried. Sandra says it makes you keep things to yourself and you think no one's going to believe you.
You can't tell other people. You just physically cannot actually say the words.
This, of course, went to court, and Sandra explained that this was an ongoing abusive situation. She had an AVO on Mark at the time, but the court said that because she had not reported any of the prior abuse over 28 years to police, it was inadmissible. During Mark Burt's sentencing, Judge Bowden said by ramming her off the road, he had put Sandra in danger as well as other drivers. Mark admitted his guilt in relation to more than 20 charges in Albany District Court. Of these charges, 17 of them were breaching the AVO. The court also heard Mark had tried to influence witnesses by calling his son from jail and asking him to convince his mother to drop the charges. Really? So for all these 20 plus charges, Mark's sentence was 5 years. Yep, 5 years. But of course, that was less the time served, and he would be eligible for parole in 3. When his sentence was handed down, Sandra said she was horrified. She said, quote, "I have scars on my face and all of them were given to me by Mark. Look at my face and tell me there's been no violence." Sandra shared her story at the time and hoped it would encourage other people who are victims of domestic violence to speak out. She said, quote, "There were years I thought it would never go that far, but when push really comes to shove, if someone really starts to lose the plot, you never know what will happen." That is so true. You never know what someone's capable of. So if you are in or trying to leave a domestically abusive relationship, please take all precautions. Seek the help of a DV service to make a safety plan. It's better to have it and not need it than the other way around. This sentence was way too lenient in my humble opinion, and Marky Boy decided to prove that once a scuzz bucket, always a scuzz bucket is a true statement by once again being sentenced to 4 years and 7 months prison after pleading guilty to charges of deprivation of liberty and bodily harm in June of 2021. ABC News says the court heard Mark had assaulted his partner, not Sandra by the way, a new partner, in his caravan in April of 2020 when he sat on her to pin her down and then broke her finger attempting to force her to unlock her phone. He threw the victim on his bed, straddled her chest, and held his hand over her mouth. When he then inserted his fingers into her mouth, the victim bit down. Mark proceeded to wrap a bedsheet around his hand and shoved it down the victim's throat, shouting, "You want to bite me again?" The court then heard that Mark blocked the exit of the caravan after the victim asked to leave. He also refused to let the woman use the toilet or get a drink of water. She was pleading to be able to leave, but he was in control, and that was that. The victim attended Albany Hospital a few days later with severe lacerations to her uvula and tongue and frenulum. So all in the back of her throat and all the connecting tissue that holds your tongue and lips in. Ugh. Judge Linda Petrusa during sentencing said Mark's previous time in custody had not deterred him from reoffending. She said, quote, "When I look at past offences and I look at what you did on this occasion, the record makes it clear you are currently a danger to any woman who is in an intimate personal relationship with you. What you did was cruel and you showed no compassion for her when she complained of her inability to breathe and later of the pain she was in." End quote. But despite recognising this, Mark is sentenced to 4 years and 7 months and will be eligible for parole in 2 years and 7 months. So he gets another slap on the wrist and he'll be free to go out and do it all over again. Seriously, something needs to change. Oh, it's so frustrating. Okay, I didn't get too riled up, but oh my goodness. That is all I have for you today, my loves. Thank you for being here with me. If you're finding this content valuable, please do all the YouTubey things and like, subscribe, share, and hit the bell so you don't lose my little channel on the interwebs. And please leave your thoughts about this case in the comments box below. And as always, there is a list of resources below if the content of this case has raised any concerns for you regarding your own relationship or that of a loved one. Thanks for being here, and until next time, please take care of yourselves and be kind to one another.